So this morning, I will continue reading the book Transactionalism by Trevor J. Phillips. Continuing with Chapter 2, we'll be reading the sections on pragmatism, Darwinism, continuity, and the theory of inquiry. Pragmatism as the antecedent of transactionalism. The names of Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, George Herbert Mead, and John Dewey have long been conjoined by their respective biographers and other commentators of the philosophic scene. As the major formulators of the pragmatic movement, their writings have been, and are currently being, examined and re-examined in the light of historical perspective. It is perhaps unfortunate that so much energy is dissipated in this examination, and not more devoted to and expended on genuine reappraisal. Henry David Aiken minced no words when he described the present age as one of timid and ideological neo-pragmatism, which advances nowhere beyond the lessons of the masters. However, it is maintained that the findings of this study will concur with a further remark of Aiken's. He wrote that an inner dialectic of pragmatism may be traced from its thesis in Peirce through its antithesis in James to its synthesis in Dewey, and that within the synthesis of the latter is to be found the thesis for a new development. This section will demonstrate that the transactionalism of contemporary times finds its direct antecedents in and has received invaluable succor from the thought of the earlier pragmatists. It will begin with a brief description of the effects of the Darwinian theory of evolution on the philosophical climate of the late 19th century, and proceed to enumerate and elaborate on the salient ideas and doctrines of Peirce, James, and Mead in the context of their contributions to the transactional point of view. The early seminal writings of Dewey will be considered separately in succeeding chapters. Darwinism in philosophy. Arthur Bentley has applied the adjective Darwinian to an era in research in which an evolving universe is accepted to include organisms, among them human beings, with all their behavioral activity. This era began in earnest with the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species and his later Descent of Man, both of which offered seemingly irrefutable evidence for the evolution of man from lower forms or even different organisms. Further, it was argued that man and his life experiences are literally a part of nature. The furor among American intellectuals following these scientific revelations has been chronicled by numerous philosophically oriented historians. Blau, for example, credited Darwin with having biologized philosophy, with having brought about a movement away from concern with the fixed principles of being in the direction of becoming and change. Inquiry into process, not structure, was to be Darwin's scientific legacy. Blau saw Darwinism as a great stimulant to pragmatic thought in the latter years of the 19th century. For now, the origin of thinking could be readily explained as the development by the human animal of a special instrument of adaptation to his environment, as one aspect of the process of becoming a dominant species within nature. Thinking became for the evolutionary naturalist a form of conduct directed toward the end of survival. This was important in that it considered thinking as a natural process developed in the natural context and thus helped to break down some of the difficulties which earlier philosophers had faced in explaining the nature of knowledge. In effect, the theory of organic evolution suggested that the mental and cognitive powers, as well as the body, were products of gradual development oriented to the needs of everyday life. The significance of this suggestion was enormous, if it were conceded that reflective thought is a natural development of the evolutionary process, then it followed that this thought must be creative and not representational, a dynamic product, not a static reflection. It is against this backdrop that the following concepts should be viewed. Continuity and fallibility. The full impact of Darwinian thought on the late 19th century philosophy is typified in the writings of Charles Sanders Peirce, and particularly in his concept of fallibilism, which will be shown to be a direct transactional antecedent. In a manuscript believed to have been written in 1897, Peirce discussed the relationship between fallibilism, continuity, and evolution. In terms of his influence on succeeding generations of philosophers and scientists, this particular excerpt is especially significant. It is obvious, he wrote, that the operation of law cannot create diversity where none existed before. Consequently, all this exuberant diversity of nature cannot be the result of law. Spontaneity, on the other hand, is the character of not resulting by law from something antecedent. The universe, with all its diversity and spontaneity, cannot result from the operation of blind law. By continuity, Peirce meant a fluidity, the merging of part into part, and he held that it is indeed possible to infer true continuity, that whatever the underlying psychical process may be, we seem to perceive a genuine flow of time such that instants melt into one another without separate individuality. Not only time, but space and degree of quality are continuous. In point of fact, once the reality of continuity is admitted, reasons are there for admitting the continuity of all things. Consider, Peirce requested, the question of one mind acting upon another. How can this possibly occur? How is it possible for one particle of matter to act upon another when the two are at a distance from one another? To answer that there is no explanation, that the phenomena is absolutely unintelligible, was for Peirce a poor kind of theory, in that it refused to perform the sole legitimate function demanded of every theory, the explaining of observed facts. The theory of continuity, however, explained the phenomenon of interaction of mind on mind by declaring that one portion of the mind acts upon another, because it is in a measure immediately present to that other, just as we suppose that the infinitesimally past is in a measure present. And in like manner, we may suppose that one portion of matter acts upon another because it is in a measure in the same place. Detected in the above quotation is an inchoate field theory and a strong sense of the transactional tendency to advocate the interdependency of diverse aspects of experience. Peirce affirmed that the principle of continuity is actually the idea of fallibilism objectified. The latter proclaims the tentative nature of all philosophical speculations, and is consequently supported by men who are animated by the spirit of science. It is characterized by uncertainty and indeterminacy, and rests on the belief that knowledge is never absolute. If then fallibilism is the doctrine that knowledge swims in a continuum of uncertainty and of indeterminacy, it followed for Peirce that continuity involves the swimming of all things in continua. The theory of evolution, as interpreted by Peirce, served to bring the doctrines of fallibilism and continuity into sharper focus. Evolution is growth, but by this is implied more than mere increases. It is diversification, increase of variety. To the fallibilist, all things are continuous. The universe is undergoing continuous growth from non-existence to existence, and all human behaviors, to employ a contemporary term, are brought within the scope of this evolving cosmos. to subject themselves to unmolested inquiry. This is not to suggest necessarily that the world for science is a unity, but at least a continuity of processes and conditions that make possible a continuity of inquiry, a continuity of analysis, a continuity of scientific method. Theory of inquiry. To Peirce, again, must be attributed some seminal thought concerning inquiry and its methodology. The endless investigation which would tend to bring scientific belief is initiated by the irritation of doubt, which in turn produces a struggle to attain a state of belief. To this struggle, Peirce affixes the term inquiry, whose sole object is the settlement of opinion or belief. By these latter terms, and particularly belief, he meant the demi-cadence which closes a musical phrase in the symphony of our intellectual life. To approach inquiry from a scientifically transactional background, or perspective, is to permit observation to run free within its framework of postulation, a postulation which omits, bars, purported faculties, powers, or realities, and further, is to secure reports on the unfractured knowing known events. Peirce anticipated this characteristic of transactionalism when he issued the caveat, "Do not block the way of inquiry." This, he maintained, is a corollary of his first rule of reason. In order to learn, you must want to learn, and in so desiring, not be satisfied with what you already incline to think. Peirce listed 4 ways in which the barricading of the road of further advance toward the truth manifest themselves. Such barricades would be entirely familiar to present-day transactionalists. 1. The belief in absolute assertion, wherein the process of teaching becomes more important than the process involved in learning. 2. The belief that the truth can never be known. 3. The belief that a particular element of science is discrete, independent, inexplicable. This assertion does not reflect ignorance on the part of the investigator. Rather, it is held that there simply is nothing more to be known about the element. 4. The maintaining of a law or truth to be the last and perfect formulation. The influence that these attitudes have on later pragmatists and their writings in the area of inquiry is almost inestimable. Commenting on one of Peirce's typical statements regarding experimentation and investigation, John Dewey, 25 years after the former's death, wrote, "As far as I'm aware, he was the first writer on logic to make inquiry and its methods the primary and ultimate source of logical subject matter." 10 years later, Dewey, together with Arthur Bentley, had enshrined inquiry in their joint formulation. Transaction is inquiry, of a type in which existing descriptions of events are accepted only as tentative and preliminary, so that new descriptions of the aspects and phases of events, whether in widened or narrowed form, may freely be made at any and all states of the inquiry. Theory of signs. The contribution of Peirce's concept of sign has been gratefully acknowledged by contemporary transactionalists in the following manner. That phrase of Peirce, to say that thought cannot happen in an instant but requires a time, is but another way of saying that every thought must be interpreted in another, or that all thought is in signs, was the most pregnant I have ever seen. For Peirce, a sign was something which stands to somebody for something in some respect or capacity. It is anything which determines something else to refer to an object to which itself refers. Thus is stressed the semantic importance of logic, with the insight that the only way man has of rendering the world comprehensible is to make it comprehensible for him. It follows that it is impossible for man to have a conception of the absolutely incognizable. That is, the only possible meaning the world can have is a practical meaning. It is human or it is nothing. All man's thoughts are in signs and meaning, in the language of signs. Is the translation of a sign into another sign or system of signs. This connection between thought and sign needs expansion. By the former, Peirce implied action, and the relationship between thought as action and sign is well exemplified in the following statement, in which an illustration of word as sign is also proffered. If you look into a textbook of chemistry for a definition of lithium, you may be told that it is that element whose atomic weight is 7 very nearly. But if the author has a more logical mind, he will tell you that if you search among minerals that are vitreous, translucent, gray, or white, very hard, brittle, and insoluble, for one which imparts a crimson tinge to an unluminous flame, this mineral being titrated with lime or witherite, ratsbane, and fused, can be partly dissolved in muriatic acid, and if this solution be evaporated, and the residue be extracted with sulfuric acid, and duly purified, it can be converted by ordinary methods into chloride, which, being obtained in the solid state, fused and electrolyzed with 6 powerful cells, will yield a globule of a pinkish silvery metal, and will float on gasoline. And the material of that is a specimen of lithium. The peculiarity of this definition, or rather this precept, that is more serviceable than a definition, is that it tells you what the word lithium denotes by prescribing what you are to do in order to gain a perceptual acquaintance with the object of the word. In this extended quotation, Peirce flatly denied the separation or the independence of word, idea, and object. The sign lithium is not an intervening agent. Indeed, if there is an intervener at all, it is man behaving, with the sign prescribing what he is to do. To function as a sign, to signify, is a way of operating of the organism in its environment, a cooperating of powers of the environment with powers of the organism, where by powers is meant that which is encountered only in functioning. All knowledge of powers being derived from operatings. This cooperating of the powers of the environment with those of the organism is what occurs when the latter is said to have responded to stimuli, and implies a genuine interaction or transaction between the two aspects of the operating situation. To respond to a stimulus is to react to something as a sign, as was made clear in the lithium example. It is to impute meaning to experience. A basic characteristic of transactionalism is involved in the seeing of an event as filling a certain duration of time as a description across a full duration, rather than as composed of an addition or other kind of combination of separate instantaneous or short-span events. Peirce uniformly held that sign could not be conceived in isolation. His lithium example demonstrated the close relation between word and object, the behavioralistically oriented account of sign, and further demonstrated the fact that signifying is not a mysterious addition to man's natural interactions, but is a feature of processes on the organic level. From his proposition that every thought is a sign, Peirce logically maintained that every thought must relate to some other, must, that is, actually determine some other, since, That is the essence of a sign. As he admitted, this is in reality a restatement of the axiom that in the immediate present there is no thought, or that all which is reflected upon has passed. In the sequential movement of signs spread out into the past, the meaning of the earlier ones in the series is provided by or constituted by the latter ones as their interpretants, until a conclusion is reached. To return to Peirce's statement on the subject, to say that thought cannot happen in an instant but requires a time is but another way of saying that every thought must be interpreted in another, or that all thought is in signs. Consequently, signs form an infinite series, so that no conclusion of reasoning may be held as absolute or final, it being, by its very nature, open to modification of meaning by further signs. Peirce has expressed the same doctrine more vehemently. From the principle that there is no intuition or cognition not determined by previous cognitions, it follows that the striking in of a new experience is never an instantaneous affair, but is an event occupying time, and coming to pass by a continuous process. There is no exception to the law that every thought sign is translated or interpreted in a subsequent one, unless it be that all thought comes to an abrupt and final end in death. Contemporary transactional employment of this doctrine, of the sequential movement of sign, is found in Knowing and the Known. There, the word behavior is taken to cover all the adjustmental activities of the organism environment without limiting the word to overt outcomes of physical or physiological processes. And the word sign is closely united with it, for where sign is found, we have behavior, and where behavior occurs, sign process is involved. Although further clarification will have to be deferred until a later discussion of the reflex arc concept, it will be suffice to conclude the present section on signs and their contribution to the transactional point of view by remarking that a stimulus is regarded by transactionalists as a sign of a way things have of acting or behaving. This is another way of stating that certain operations encountered as signs signify ways of operating and being cooperated with.